Stephen Patterson, welcome back to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back and have another chat.
Absolutely. So anyone that wants a bit more of a detailed background on you, they can go back and listen to the first episode, which is a couple of years ago now. But there's a few things changed in terms of your role and what you're doing at St Mary's University. Would you mind just giving a bit of an update?
Yeah, certainly. So I guess the main one is I'm now the director of the our research performance center, which is sort of heading up all the research and sort of trying to guide us through what we're doing from a performance aspect within St Mary's University. And then also I'm the head of the professional doctorate in strength and conditioning also, so I lead that program, which is a distance learning program, PhD program, which has 2 years of taught and 3 years of research on top of it, so it's a 5-year part-time program. We have about sort of 7 or 8 students every year on it. Started last year. Students all over the world, sort of from America right through to places like Malta and different places across Europe. So running quite well at the minute. It's our second year running it, so it's really good and good to be engaging with lots of, I guess, practitioners who are really interested in developing themselves as practitioners and trying to improve where they're going with regards to strength and conditioning.
It's become quite a popular thing to do, hasn't it? The professional doctorate. Like Leeds Beckett do one, LGMU, Birmingham, yourselves. Competitive market.
Yeah, like we're very specialised in ours is the only one in strength and conditioning. Obviously the other ones are more sports science, and then obviously you have strength and conditioning coaches and so on go through it. Ours is, I guess, twofold the reasons why we did it. One, from our masters, which is online, we wanted to recruit more people from America, and the PhD program was the main thing that we were really getting pushed on. And we also have a lot of students within our own master's program who have went off to do those other professional doctorates. And we were like, well, actually, we can give that opportunity to them. But our professional doctorate, I guess, is a little bit different in that it's more of an American type model, in that there's a taught element and then a research element, whereas a lot of the others are a bit more about reflective practice. So ours is a little bit more sort of, here's some of the do's and don'ts of training, here's some of the training understanding and so on. And they will have discussions and seminars around that and talk about what people are doing in practice. So they're obviously reflecting as they're within that, but there's more, we're talking about different modalities of training and that side of things. So it is slightly different, but we're hoping, as I said, it's more specific to strength and conditioning. But again, it's the education university market, and I'm sure that we'll find more and more coming on board in the next few years and more students wanting to apply for these things.
We had a little bit of a chat before we press record, and I'm just asking this before we get into the blood flow restriction training stuff. Are PhDs and doctorates slowly becoming the norm and the next thing to have to not gain entry into the industry, but like even just get to a mid-level position? Is it almost becoming the norm?
I would say they're not, to get a mid-level position, we're not at that stage we need a PhD. And I'm not an advocate that everyone has to have a PhD and so on. That's definitely not what we're trying to do it for. Certainly if you get to the higher end and you're looking at the sort of head of performance roles and director performance and so on, I'm not saying, again, that you have to have a PhD. But I think even if you look at what's coming out of America and other places, some of those top roles, almost you do have to have PhDs and so on. I think that's translating a bit across here into the UK and elsewhere. And if you look at a lot of practitioners at those top ends, there's quite a lot of people now have them. They've went through the traditional PhD route where they're doing a part-time PhD while they work, which is not necessarily a professional doctorate. But you just have to look at the success, as I said, of Leeds Beckett, Liverpool, John Moores, Birmingham and so on with Barry Trust's stuff. There's a lot of people, especially in football and other sports, that are doing them. So there's more and more people do have them. And therefore that makes it a more competitive marketplace when people are then trying to get jobs and apply for positions. And if you have that, I guess, if you have that reflection, you have that understanding, you probably can see things from a greater sort of height and actually look down on things and say, well, actually, we need to take a more holistic view over things rather than actually the day-to-day S&C side of things. So I don't know if it'll ever be, you have to have one to get a certain position. I think we know in sport that doesn't mean anything, sometimes who so that you don't always have to have the qualification. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing in some regards. But certainly I would never be an advocate where, if you want to get into S&C, you want to get into applied sport science, that you have to do undergrad, masters, S&C, because we know the cost that goes across with that across the board, and the pay isn't always reflective. So I think you have to be careful about when you do these things and whether it's worth your time, and that's what you're looking to. If you've got a long-term project and that's what you want to do, 100%. But if you know that you're not going to be in sport for much longer, it's not the type of thing that you'd be thinking about. There's transferable skills, but you need to have, consider that.
Cool. Right. Let's get into the blood flow restriction training chat, meat of the conversation. Because I think even since last time we spoke, which was probably 2 or 3 years ago, things are moving fast in terms of new tech on the market, new research coming out, and just more general knowledge about blood flow restriction training.
Yep.
It could be said that it could all be down to the podcast that we did a while ago, but who knows?
Who knows, yeah.
But in terms of the physiology behind blood flow restriction, would you mind just giving us an overview, just to kind of the basics?
Yeah, certainly. I think at its most basic sense, we are restricting blood flow into the working muscle. So we are partially restricting arterial blood flow, and we're preventing venous return. So we're preventing that blood returning back to the heart. And we're never fully restricting blood flow, so we're not fully stopping the blood flow into the muscle, and we're just reducing it. Normally, between 40 and 80% of reduction in blood flow. And essentially, at its most basic level, that's causing fatigue earlier. And that's really all it is. It's not a magic potion. It's not doing something totally different. It's just basically with the protocols we use and what we're actually doing, we're actually allowing people to fatigue much earlier. And that fatigue, even though we're using very light loads, means therefore we're recruiting those faster twitch muscle fibers. Hence why you get stronger, you get increases in muscle mass and so on. So you can do repetitions to failure, and that will, in theory, give you some of the similar responses to blood flow restriction training. But obviously to do that takes much more time, effort, and so on. So there's certain situations where blood flow restriction is beneficial, and others it isn't. There's lots of different things go on. So we get increased recruitment of fast twitch fibers. That's probably our main driver. And this early fatigue. There's lots of other things go on. We get increases in protein synthesis. We get increases in gene regulation, whether that for protein synthesis and other things. So there's lots of things go on. Very similar to what happens with normal training. And at the end of the day, it gives you a very similar response to normal conventional resistance exercise, just with lower loads. I guess the one thing I would say, there's probably a bit of a, you talk about blood flow restriction, and the first thing that people probably think is just resistance exercise. And I think the key thing to always remember is there's multiple different modes and multiple different applications of blood flow restriction. So when you're using that term, is it resistance exercise? Is it aerobic exercise? Is it passive? Where we're doing nothing, we're just applying the blood flow restriction on its own. Is it neuromuscular electrical stimulation? There's loads of different ways that we can apply a stimulus with blood flow restriction. And you can imagine then that they all cause slightly different responses, slightly different adaptations. And from my perspective, the key thing is understanding the physiology. And then you can say, well, how can I apply something to my athlete or my individual? And to create that adaptation or to create the response the desired response that you're looking for.
So that recruitment of fast twitch muscle fibers, that as soon as you say that, I'm guessing it perks people's interest. Does that particular adaptation lead to a certain use that people are doing out there with BFR?
Yeah, at the end of the day, if you lift heavy, you're going to recruit those fibers, right? That's just the Henneman's size principle would just lead to the idea that once you start lifting, and once you start lifting a certain load, you're going to recruit those fast twitch fibers. Obviously, if you're lifting 30% of your 1 repetition max, that's not going to start recruiting them. But especially after that first set, which is that you do it, well, the standard scheme is that 30, 15, 15, and 15 repetition scheme. That first 30 is basically just starting to deoxygenate the tissue. And basically, it doesn't feel any different than it would be if you didn't have the cuff on, really. It's when you go into the second, third, and fourth sets, you start to feel that fatigue. And you can imagine as you fatigue and you start to get tired, the muscle starts to fatigue. It needs to recruit more fibers in order to move the load. And then that's what's causing that greater recruitment at that stage.
So we've got 1 to 5 scenarios, and there may be more. I'm sure there is more, but the 5 that I've come up with for the purpose of this chat that people may be using BFR for. First one is strength, and you've detailed there why someone may use it, but it'd be great to get some example protocols, or just from your knowledge of speaking to practitioners all over the world, of what people are actually doing here. So is there any particular protocols that people are using to develop strength, and is there any difference between, I'm asking you 15 questions in one here, but like basic stuff between upper body and lower body? How do protocols differ? It'd be great to get an insight into that if possible.
Yeah, certainly. I think with regards to strength, and I think you can probably tie the strength and hypertrophy up a little bit, because you're sort of getting similar responses, and again, it's when you apply it, really. So if you're applying it into someone who is deconditioned or someone who's injured, well, then you're going to get some very good strength adaptations, and some very rapid strength adaptations, up to 100% within quite a short period of time. Now, that's very dependent on where you're starting from. So if you have someone who's deconditioned, who's weak because of injury, well, of course, you're going to get a higher response than you've got someone who's really well trained. So from a strength perspective, you're getting those adaptations, especially in those deconditioned individuals. Now, if we look at BFR compared to, say, conventional training or low load training on its own, especially in injured populations, BFR is more superior from a strength adaptations perspective. When we start to move towards heavy load training, and as you get healthy, well, heavy load training is going to give you slightly greater strength adaptations. Okay, and that's because there's more neurological effect because of the load that you're lifting. So if you're healthy and you have no problems, then adding blood flow restriction in for a strength adaptation isn't really seen as a wise thing to do.
Just lift heavy instead.
Exactly. And even from a rehab perspective, in my mind, it's a short-term fix to transition back into the heavy load training. Now, what I would do in a rehab setting, if I wanted to optimize my strength, is I would, whatever limb was injured, I would do that with blood flow restriction, and in the opposite limb, I would use heavy loads. Now, in the short term, you would have some sort of asymmetry issues, but I don't really care, because I'm getting stronger in one limb and the other leg has to catch up. And you're going to get that cross-transfer effect from the heavy load training, which is going to give you even greater adaptations than just the BFR on its own. So I think you want to use heavy to your advantage, but at no stage, in my opinion, should you be using BFR if you're looking to create a strength stimulus, unless you're on a deload or some other reasons to do that. From an upper lower body perspective, again, pretty similar. There's no difference in that. The science would back that up, that both are going to be similar responses, and both heavy loads would be better than BFR, which are both better than low load. Protocol wise, it's pretty standard. Again, the 30, 15, 15, 15 is pretty standard across all the resistance exercise protocols. You can go to failure. I think you just have to be careful to failure. I've talked earlier on about the fatigue that you get with it. If you take yourself to failure every single time, then you're potentially, it's all right if it's maybe you and me and we're not training for anything else. But if you're working with athletes and they've got other stimulus that's going on, I think we want to try and keep them as fresh as possible and actually do as little as we can for stimulus that's going to give us that adaptation.
So just to interrupt, Stephen, that 30, 15, 15, 15, that's, what's the units percentage?
No, so that's 30% of your one repetition max.
Yep, okay. Yep.
And those are just your repetitions. So 75 repetitions split into 4 sets with 30 seconds recovery in between. And again, you get a similar response with regards to the if you go to failure as well. I think one of the big advantages of that repetition scheme is that actually, whilst you need to test people for the repetition max and so on, that you can do that, and we do that from a research perspective. In the real world, it's not always possible. If you've got someone who's injured, you're not necessarily going to test their one repetition max. But once you do that one series of exercise, you'll get a pretty good indication, early on, whether or not that's sufficient or not. So if someone's only able to do 30 repetitions, you've load far too heavy. If someone's able to get to sort of almost 50 repetitions up to 75, you're in that sort of sweet spot, and you can just keep going until they hit 75 reps a couple of times and then start to move load. If they do 75 reps and they felt like this was so easy, there was nothing to it, well, then your load's way too low. So within one session, as a practitioner, you'll know exactly what you need to be doing, whether you need to upload, keep it the same, and so on. And then from there, you can start manipulating it and moving things through from there.
So what kind of pressure are we looking at in that 15, 15, 15?
So again, depending on what the desired outcome is. So we standardize our pressures always by limb occlusive pressure or arterial occlusive pressure, which is the minimum pressure required to fully stop all blood flow into the working muscle. And that we classify that as 100%. So if we work between 40 and 80%, we know we're letting blood flow in, and therefore we're in that sort of safe realm. We find that anything below 40% limb occlusive pressure, we don't really see the adaptations. And anything above 80%, we don't really need. It's too close to 100% and too painful and so on. We definitely don't need to fully stop all blood flow. You'll see fatigue happen quickly, and you don't do enough repetitions to create stimulus. So upper body, you can probably get away with about 40 to 50% of your limb occlusive pressure. I would always go around 50%, just mainly because we done some work a while ago where if you change your body position, whenever you're measuring your limb occlusive pressure, obviously that changes your limb occlusive pressure outright. So if you're lying down, seated, standing, obviously that's going to have an influence. And you can imagine if you lie down and do your limb occlusive pressure, and say you pick 40%, and then you stand up, well, actually now you're below 40% whenever you're doing the exercise. So I always try to err on the side of caution of 50%. I think would be much better for the upper body, so you don't drop under. And for the lower body, you're probably closer towards 60 to 80% of your limb occlusive pressure seems to be more effective, just because the muscles are bigger and seems to need that more stimulus in order to create it. There is some evidence at the lower end, but I think 60 to 80 is generally where we seem to sit with regards to our recommendations and what people are doing.
So that limb occlusive pressure, is there a certain variation between populations, or is that pretty okay?
Yeah, there will be. So it depends on, the biggest thing that's going to depend on is the size of your limb. So what limb occlusive pressure does, it allows you to standardize across, say for example, different people, different equipment even, and so on. So your limb occlusive pressure, if I give you an arbitrary pressure of 150 millimeters of mercury, well, for you that may be 50% of your limb occlusive pressure, but for me it might be 30, and all of a sudden I'm not getting an effective dose at that, even at that pressure. So it allows us to standardize, and that's probably the key thing with it. And actually it's allowed us to standardize even the way we do the research and the way we apply it now in practice, because certainly back when I first started, when we were doing all this, that we weren't actually doing that. We were just picking arbitrary numbers, and we were getting lucky if we got a result or not, because there's two things influence it. The size of the limb influences your limb occlusive pressure, and the size of the cuff, the width of the cuff. So the wider the cuff, the lower the limb occlusive pressure, and the thinner the cuff, it's going to be much higher. But there's a balance, obviously. You don't want it too wide, which it restricts your exercise. So you have to find that balancing act between the two to allow you to perform whatever tasks it is you're trying to do. Obviously, there's loads of companies in the market, and they're designing things which are allowing you to do that. But we find normally sort of 10, 12 centimeter cuffs are probably the sweet spot in that regard. That's not a 100%, but that's just where it is. We just seem to get that enough room to sort of do the exercise, but also enough low enough pressure. My argument always is we want to have as low a pressure as we possibly can have in order to create the adaptation. We're not looking to just outcompete each other and just go, well, hold on, let's keep putting pressure up. We don't need to do that. You want to get it as low as possible to create the stimulus.
So in terms of the cuffs themselves, does that differ between lower body and upper body? Or should you be having a wider cuff for lower and narrow cuff for upper, for example?
Yeah, generally you tend to see, again, it depends on the company and who's putting it together and so on. There are different width cuffs for some devices, and some devices are just the same size cuff depending on what you do. Some cuffs are straight, just a straight cuff, which means, and then some are contoured, so some fit the limb. The conical shape, so they're actually fit the limb. And obviously you can imagine those ones obviously then reduce your limb occlusive pressure because they fit more snug, and they then therefore reduce all the any waste. If you have a straight cuff, it's not going to fit perfectly round an arm or a leg, so therefore it means that there's a little bit more waste in the regards to the pressure. It has to be slightly higher to fully restrict that blood flow. So yeah, it really depends on who the company is and what they're using, and that will dictate whether or not there's a different size cuff. Some of the more expensive companies and devices, they give you different options of different sizes. Obviously the lower, cheaper versions have just got one cuff, but you can obviously buy different size cuffs and pump them up and so on. So those are all in play, I guess.
And positioning of the cuff, obviously that's going to be important. Can you give us a detail of how people could navigate that?
Yeah, look, it's probably really simple in most senses, that you're basically looking to put it as high up the limb as you possibly can, right? And there's two main the main reason for that is that there's more, I guess, fat and muscle mass at the very top of the arm or top of the leg, and actually we're staying away from nerves. As you know, if you go lower down the leg, and you've seen in the past, nobody's doing it anymore, thank goodness, but people used to put it just below the knee, and there's nerves there which can cause real serious damage. And you want to, there's no different from restricting down there and it is up the top, apart from it's safer. So actually keeping it at the very top is the ideal way to do it. That obviously means you've got a slightly higher limb occlusive pressure, but it's going to be there when you're doing the exercise. So it's not a major thing, and actually it's probably easier to do that. You can imagine if you're trying to contract your muscle and the cuff's right in the middle of the muscle belly, that's not going to be useful. So we want to have it as high up as possible to sort of stop that happening.
So just to move down the 5 ways that people may be using BFR. So we've kind of nailed the strength and the hypertrophy, pretty putting them together.
Just to say, Rob, the hypertrophy side of things is slightly different from the strength in that it's as effective as heavy load training. So even in healthy people. So if you want to put on muscle mass and you have blood flow restriction or you have heavy load training, you could use both interchangeably. They will both do the same things. Strength will be better with heavy load. Hypertrophy, no difference. Now, my argument still is, if you're healthy, in general, why would you waste the time of applying cuffs to do it and so on when you can just lift heavy? So, but obviously from a rehab perspective, when you can't lift heavy, it's very beneficial. And we know we lose a lot of muscle mass during certain injuries and so on. So that's where a lot of it comes in. The other part where you can use it from a hypertrophy perspective, I guess in healthy individuals, is more around there's a high frequency aspect of it. We can get some adaptations pretty quickly in 2 to 3 weeks if you do it once or twice a day. So there's, again, opportunities of allowing you to do this almost microdosing of BFR in certain strategies. Or, if you've got someone who needs to get muscle on quickly or different things, there's an opportunity there. But it's about thinking about the logic. Again, that doesn't mean it's special. It just means because you recover quicker from it, you actually can then put a higher stimulus. But once you get to 2 or 3 weeks, you're not going to get any more benefit from that. And if you've done that once or twice before, you're not going to keep getting the benefit of it, as you would expect with any type of training modality. So hypertrophy, there's certainly elements there where you can think about how you can mix and match it. And there's certainly some aspects with regards to the athletes. But again, if you can lift heavy, unless you've got things set up in a really quick and easy manner, I would stay heavy. I wouldn't bother if I'm healthy.
So, apart from the frequency and the microdosing aspect of, if you're looking for hypertrophy, if you're a healthy athlete, if that's the goal, what's the justification for people using BFR in them scenarios? Healthy athlete, hypertrophy aim. There's people out there clearly using BFR with them two things. What's their justification? What do you think their justification is for it?
Honestly, I don't know. I think realistically, it's probably a bit of buy-in from the athlete. It's the usual. Actually, if we program 80% of our work to do this and give the athlete 20%, so they feel that they're getting something from it and they get a pump or they do whatever, maybe that's where it comes into play. I think a lot of people in the early days were doing things like using it as a finisher and saying you're potentially getting greater adaptations as a finisher with BFR. There was one study which showed it, but it's not true. It's been disproved quite a few times. So it's not giving you any added benefit. And I guess there's a bit of potentially it allows you to add a bit more volume, because there is some potential there, but in a matched volume workload, it's not giving you any more. But if you can do more volume with it, potentially there's some benefit there. So I think it's a bit of a mix and match of that. And again, look, athletes, the one thing I would say, athletes love blood flow restriction training because they like the pain. They like, doing BFR is not a straightforward exercise. It's quite intense. And what we found is athletes feel like they've worked. So when they do it, they think, well, I've actually had a session here. I can feel the muscle. I know there's a pump. I've got that sensation. So therefore, they feel like they've had something happening. Where sometimes, you could do slightly lower repetitions. You're creating a stimulus and adaptation, but you don't really feel like you've had a pump or anything from it. And they start thinking, what's that? having anything, whereas with this, it just triggers them and they think they're potentially having something. So, especially from a hypertrophy perspective, that's where there is. There's other things around pain, which we can talk about a bit later if you want, which I think there is big benefits of, but that would be where I would go if I've got people who are generally healthy or athletes.
Let's go there now. We can leave.
Yep.
We'll come back to the rehab. We've touched on it rehab a little bit, but yeah, talk to us about the pain situation.
Okay, so I guess we've done a lot of work recently, and I think if you look back to what everyone was doing back originally, when people talk about pain and blood flow restriction, we're talking about the pain you felt during the exercise, okay? And it was sore and people didn't like it, or they were able to push through it and so on. And that was a lot of it. There is pain when you do BFR, but that's a lot of it because we weren't setting pressures correctly, weren't using the right equipment, loads, all the other things that go with it. In more recent times, I guess, since it's went into the rehab realm, a lot of times people keep coming back saying, I feel, pain-free in the next, couple of hours after doing this, and people were getting this sort of reporting back all the time. Now you can imagine if you were healthy, nobody was reporting that because they weren't in pain in the first place. So we did a study a few years ago in ACL population in the NHS, and we demonstrated that we got a reduction in pain following blood flow restriction for up to 24 hours after the exercise. So people who are in pain had no pain for 24 hours or reduced pain in 24 hours compared to other types of training that they would be doing sort of from a rehab perspective. So we took it back a step and we started to say, well, let's look at some of these mechanisms of what's happening. And we did another couple of studies, both in resistance exercise and aerobic exercise, where we looked at both the localized effects, so the muscle that was worked, and then the systemic effect, so the muscles away from the ones that were exercised, to have a look at the analgesic effect. And we were able to demonstrate an analgesic effect across the board, both locally and systemically, with blood flow restriction within an hour of, or a couple of, sort of half an hour of exercise. But more importantly, the local effect, so the exercise muscle, had a reduced pain again for 24 hours. So we're seeing this analgesic effect, which lasts for up to 24 hours post-exercise, which is more than what we see with normal conventional training. There's two sort of main reasons behind it. One is it leads to an increase in the endocannabinoid system. So we get some upregulation of some of those markers of the endocannabinoid system, which similar, cannabis and other things, which are going to have a pain effect. But there's also pain modulation. So because you're in pain within the muscle when you're doing the exercise, that seems to desensitize and have a reduction in pain afterwards. And so we've done that in both aerobic exercise and resistance exercise. So we've seen it, a few times actually. And I think that's probably where there's a lot of scope with regards to thinking about the physiology and understanding what's going on, and then how you apply that in with your athletes. So for example, you take the NBA, you will regularly see the athletes of the NBA doing blood flow restriction before matches or before events. And the main reason is they're trying to reduce pain. Those guys are, quite large, big. They've got a lot of niggles, just throughout the season and travel and different things. And they're using them quite extensively for pain modulation to reduce pain before games, reduce pain before training, those sorts of types of things. Now, there's some issues with that. Obviously, it depends what pain is. If it's something that's masking an injury or it's going to lead to an injury, potentially if you reduce that, you have some issues with that. You could potentially injure someone. But I think in general, that's where people are using it. There's also the potential of using it afterwards to reduce pain, depending on what that's done. And there are a lot of clubs, organisations engaging with it and speaking to us about how they do that and why they would use that. And then there's a much broader sense of people who are in pain more regularly day to day, and having a reduction in pain for quite a long period of time is quite both advantageous and sort of warranted and wanted, I guess, from practitioners.
So is the pain reduction solely muscular, or does that go out to other structures, tendons, etc.?
Yeah, I guess it's hard. Mainly muscular is what we're measuring at the minute. There's a lot of people are doing stuff around other things, tendons and other things. Whether it has whether it's the structure of the tendon, I would be doubtful. I think it's more the muscle and the surrounding area that you're potentially having that pain response. which then is then maybe everything else feels better with it. And pain is an absolute minefield, and from coming from someone who's not got that background in it, even looking at, because what's pain on a subjective score compared to an algometer, which you push in against someone's muscle to see how much pain they can take, versus a cold pressor test where you put your hand in cold water for as long as you can. There's loads of different ways that you can measure it, and it measures slightly different variations of what pain is. And I think that's where the difficulty is, in that we're seeing things happening, but actually it's hard to then say, well, this has a blanket approach to everyone and everything. I'm hearing of people having reduced pain in different scores with regards to even session RPE scores and other things that they're getting from it, and recovery scores after, so they're seeing things like that. But again, how consistent that is, I think it's how it applies in, and what the stimulus has been in order for you to help you reduce that.
So is there any particular protocols that you've seen work when it comes to kind of pre-training for the athlete populations?
Yeah, so the study that we did, and what is recommended, what people have been doing, is we find that higher pressure is more effective. So this is where we did 40 versus 80%, and whilst both were more effective than all the other types of training, 80% was actually the most effective. So it kind of makes sense if we're talking about that pain modulation. The more pain that we can create within the muscle, the more desensitization and the more pain effect that we have at a later time. So it seems to be those higher pressures. So 80% limb occlusive pressure. Repetitions, again, were pretty standard of the 75 repetitions. When it came to the aerobic exercise study, we actually, we actually didn't see limb occlusive pressure having as much of an effect. And the main reason being is that we did a cycling protocol where we had people do intervals of 5 minutes on, 1 minute off. And essentially what we demonstrated was there's some people can't take 80% limb occlusive pressure when they're cycling, because you're going for 20 minutes in comparison to like 6 minutes, even with those periods of time where you have off. And VO2 max is around about 40-50% VO2 max, so it's quite low intensity. But people couldn't take that, so we were looking sort of more 40 to 60%, and there was no difference. So generally, if you're doing the resistance exercise, slightly higher pressures. But with the aerobic exercise, it's probably middle of the road. The biggest change was definitely with the resistance exercise. We didn't compare, obviously, aerobic versus resistance, but if you from a data perspective, and you look at the changes that we've seen, there's a bigger response with regards to the resistance.
Interesting. Let's circle back to the rehab side. Yep. I know we've touched on it a couple of times, but is there any particular case studies or reasons that people may go, I think it's time we have a little try of this, and we speak to an expert like you and try to go down that route? Why would someone choose to go down that route versus their traditional kind of return to play protocols?
Yeah, look, I think the evidence is pretty clear now, and there's been loads of studies, and especially rehab, where in the last few years there's been a bit of an explosion in the area, and even the number of studies that we know are currently ongoing within different groups and across the world, America, Scandinavia, Australia, everywhere. So everyone's now looking at it from that perspective. I think pretty standard, and I think most people will agree, if you have any athlete who's load compromised and who cannot lift heavy, then you should be really considering blood flow restriction. Okay. Now, as I said, if you have someone who there'll be people who don't want to do it, and that's totally fine. And I'm not saying here you have to do it by any stretch of the imagination, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that we can get you stronger, we can increase muscle mass, we can reduce pain, which is another big thing now in that rehab setting, and more so than what we can do with low load training. Now, if we take low load training to failure, again, in a lab, it's effective. Stuart Phillips' lab in Canada have shown it quite a few times. Personally, I'm not sure how effective it is with regards to the real world, in that, we know ourselves, if you push people to a limit, well, how far do you have to push them to go to failure? And actually, what is true failure? And I think in a lab, when you're screaming and shouting at someone, you can do that, but actually, in the real world, do people get there? And if you do get there, you're doing double, triple the amount of repetitions that you would be with BFR. So I think, obviously, if you have someone who can't use it for a health reason, okay, fair enough. But generally, for a short window, I think blood flow restriction is something that can be used and should be used, even to the point where I'm not advocating this 100%, but recently even there's been some work around tendon adaptations and so on that Christopher Sentner's lab have done out of Germany, which are showing some adaptations in tendon strength and morphology changes within the tendon, which we didn't originally think or see before. So I know a lot of people are using around tendon ruptures and as well as muscle injuries, muscle strains and so on. So at its most basic level, anytime anybody's limb compromised and you can't lift heavy, blood flow restriction is probably the most beneficial at that time. Once they start to transition and once they start to get stronger and they can start to load, just transition off. There's absolutely no, you shouldn't be staying on it for months and months at a time. You can easily start to come off it. And as I said, if you have that model I talked about earlier on, where you have that heavy leg or arm and then that blood flow restriction arm, I think you're going to get those gains much quicker. You're going to get stronger much quicker, and you can transition much quicker. I think 4 to 6 weeks at a max is where you would be. I think depending on what you're doing, generally the blood flow restriction resistance exercise is the standard go-to because it's the one that seems to give us the most bang for the buck, and we actually it's quick and easy to do. You could do neuromuscular electrical stimulation with BFR in the early days if you're struggling to move and get through ranges of motion and so on, and there's some nice evidence coming out about that. It makes sense. It's just taking the brain away from the contraction, so it makes sense that it would work. But again, you're going to obviously probably move towards the BFR resistance exercise. It's the main thing. You can do aerobic exercise too at that stage, which is going to give you some benefit from a strength hypertrophy side of things, but not as much as what the resistance exercise will.
Perfect. I think that's covered the first 3: strength, hypertrophy, rehab.
Yep.
Let's get into one that I think is really interesting, and it's the recovery side.
Yeah.
We've mentioned about pain reduction post-exercise, so that's kind of in this realm anyway. But is BFR a solution, not a solution, but part of a solution for athletes, general population, post-training to maximize the recovery to enable them to go again? Okay,
so we've done some of the research in this area, so I'll put my hands up and say that from the beginning here. I guess we're at a stage where there is some merit to it. Okay, so clearly we've done some studies which there's merit to. There was an early study, I think it was before the London 2012, so it's quite a while ago. I think the paper was by Bevan, and they had done some work where they'd looked just a normal training program, just some sprints, some resistance exercise, and so on, and they'd done a blood flow restriction immediately after, passively, by the way, so no exercise, just applying the cuff, inflating it up to a pressure almost to 100% of your limb occlusive pressure. So this is a slightly different application. This is now fully restricting all blood flow and then releasing it, and almost having intermittent cycles of occlusion and reperfusion, I guess. And essentially they showed that there were some benefits of performance. They were able to maintain performance the next day during another session. There's some weaknesses obviously in the study, some little things that were more applied in a setting. We took it back a level and looked at muscle damage, just to sort of say, well, hold on, here's some of the markers that we would see following damage and following to help us with recovery. Let's have a look and see what it works on. And we found that, again, the passive blood flow restriction was 3 by 5 minutes, so 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, repeated 3 times, helped you recover at a much faster rate. Essentially, we were recovering 24 hours earlier, even 48 hours earlier in some of the markers. And I guess the main reason we were excited about was that sometimes you see in these recovery studies, you see improvements in things like creatine kinase or swelling or some of these other markers, but there's no change in function. And the argument is, well, okay, you feel better, but actually you're still poor from a function perspective, like strength's down. That could cause issues. Well, we were actually seeing strength was improved much quicker and recovered at a much faster rate, as well as reduced swelling, reduced pain, creatine kinase, and so on. We've done a few other things where we've looked at it before exercise, so almost ischemic preconditioning. And we've done that before the exercise as a recovery modality, and we've shown there's some benefit there. My only argument against it is, are we really thinking about doing things before exercise to help us with recovery after exercise? I think it's a little bit all over the place. So for me, it's about doing it immediately post is the key thing. So I think there's some merit in it. I think you do have to consider what's going on, really. I think it's very much like contrast therapy, hot and cold. You're vasoconstriction, vasodilation. That's what you're doing. You're doing it with a cuff. So the advantages are you can take cuffs with you on the road, wherever you're playing and so on. You can inflate, deflate and so on. You can do that. You can give every player a cuff. They can all do their own thing as long as they know what pressures they need to go to. So there's benefits in that regard. I think there's some, if I look at what people are suggesting in other places and what's going on, I think people are saying, well, recovery is going to have a big impact. And it's all about doing just like sort of, I've seen some examples of people doing cycling with blood flow restriction afterwards as a recovery modality. There's merit to it. And the merit would be that pain reduction that we talked about, because we've shown that study which we can do aerobic exercise and we get a reduction in pain. My only thing with it is I'm not sure if it's fully recovery. And again, there's no evidence of this, by the way. So change my mind, put the evidence out. I'm happy to sort of, go that route. And we're trying to look at some of these things as well. But we know that low load aerobic exercise with blood flow restriction, so 40-50% of your VO2 max, or just spinning your legs over or walking with blood flow restriction, can lead to an aerobic stimulus. Okay, we know it improves VO2 max. We know it improves a lot of the physiological markers which are important for aerobic adaptations. So whilst we know it also reduces pain, we're creating an aerobic stimulus there. Now, my only concern is if we're doing aerobic BFR after every training session to help you recover, is that actually we're not recovering, we're still training. Okay, so I think it may be that's where the advantage comes in, because actually people are getting just a bit more top-up conditioning, and therefore, whilst they're also getting this pain reduction, they're also getting a little bit of improvement, especially localized within the tissue, of some improvements there. So long-term, that's helping them from a recovery perspective. But most of the evidence and most of the literature is on the passive application, so just with no exercise whatsoever. And whilst I think it's useful and I think there is potential there, I also think it's early days. I also think if you're doing it, you have to play around with a couple of players and see how they feel. I've had many conversations with practitioners and people who are using it, and have had some very, very convincing results from it. But obviously that's not peer-reviewed, N of ones, all the usual that goes with it. So I can't sit here and say it's definitely what's happening. But I know it's happening in a lot of professional clubs, internationally and locally. So I think there is some merit to it. I just think we have to be a little bit careful of having blanket, just going, actually, this is definitely going to work across the board, because the evidence is all around the passive side of things. I think once we start moving into the aerobic side of things, I think there's merit to it, and we're trying to study it, to try and investigate it, but we haven't seen the evidence yet that is what's happening, and there's definitely a recovery aspect to it.
So those clubs, organisations, or individuals that are having or seeing positive results in a recovery setting, how are they monitoring recovery?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the time it's more they're looking at sort of outputs sometimes the next day and having a look and see whether people are able to maintain outputs over a period of time, and look at some of the recovery scores that they're maybe asking them for, how they're feeling and all the usual stuff. And I think that's where we have to be a little bit careful. You put something on someone, we know, you tell them it works, you tell them it's going to help them recovery, and they come in the next day and say, I'm feeling much better. Yes, potentially you're going to feel much better from a placebo perspective. I said, I'm pretty happy that if we do aerobic BFR, we're going to get a pain reduction, because we've seen that. So I have no doubt that people are feeling a little bit less sore. So that's a good thing. But as I said, I think we just have to be a little bit careful in that I also believe that's generally going to create an aerobic stimulus. And whilst in the grand scheme of things, it's probably not a bad thing, I think if you're so concerned about monitoring workload and all the other things that go in, you're putting a recovery modality in, which is still stimulating an adaptation. You're not thinking about that, you're not covering that part of it. And that could, I'm not saying it's going to cause a lot of issues, but it could start to lead to some issues in players if they're doing too much.
Mm-hmm. So an example, you got a game on a Tuesday night, Wednesday, recovery day, and this is just my experience, you'll see the 11 that did the most minutes, or 12 did the most minutes, sat on a spin bike, and they'll do half an hour on a spin bike, they'll do a little game of, this is football by the way, a little game of head tennis, and they'll go. Is it worth those who are sat on the spin bike, is it beneficial to have a cuffs on the legs? Is that gonna help the recovery process, which is why they're on the bike in the first place?
I think at the basic level we don't know, because we just haven't done that. What we do know is on a very similar protocol, we've shown that reduces pain or creates an analgesic effect. So if those players, the thing is, what are they? Are they fatigued? Have they got pain? Do you know what I mean? So actually, if they've got niggles and pain, then that's beneficial. If it's more of a neural, we just feel tired, I'm not sure it's helping. Again, I don't know that for sure. Just intuitively and knowing what the adaptation, the response is, I don't believe that that's creating recovery. But if they're in pain, they've got niggles and so on, I think there's potential there. But it's that balancing act. If you've got a player, as you said, they've played the Tuesday night, they're recovering on the Wednesday, but they've played 6 times in the last 2 weeks. Is an aerobic stimulus on the recovery day the best thing for them? Which if you apply BFR, because remember, when you apply blood flow restriction to that stimulus, which is just spinning the legs, you're making work harder. Heart rate's increasing. You're getting increase in things like blood lactate responses. You're getting increases in VO2. All these things are starting to happen. And that's not what you're meant to be doing. That's not the reason why you're doing the recovery aspect of it. So that's where I just think we have to, from a practitioner perspective, think about why you're doing it and think about how you're planning it. I don't think it's a blanket approach where you just go, actually, just throw this on for everybody. And it's going to have the same outcome and effect. I think there's probably a bit more nuance to it. I think we need to think about what is the physiological response, or what are we trying to drive here? What are we trying to adapt to?
Yeah. Cool. Next point, and I think it's a really interesting one and a really important one, obviously. And I think you've covered it a little bit, and that's just safety considerations, like super basic, like stick it out there just as a bit of a small print when it comes to BFR. What are the main safety considerations that practitioners need to be aware of?
Yeah, look, I think in the grand scheme of things, it's really safe and no issues in the grand scheme of things, especially with athletes who are generally healthy, no problems, so on. If you have people who have some pre-existing conditions, then there might be some risks. So people who've got histories of blood clots or at risk of extra blood clotting and so on, they're the people who are mainly at risk. BFR on its own doesn't cause blood clotting. There's a lot of evidence to show actually the inflation-deflation actually decreases the risk of thrombosis and so on. So all that's really good, and that's probably but you can imagine if you have blood clot or you have something going on, then all of a sudden there's a lot of pressure where you're increasing and decreasing things, releasing it, and that could move something around. So that's where the risk comes down from that side of things. Again, neurological sort of responses around nerves, and that's why we put the cuffs as high as we possibly can. It's why we want to generally know what pressure we're applying and so on, so that we can try and, again, make it as low as possible for the desired outcome. That's where we're sort of going with. If you've got somebody again in rehab, the early stages of rehab, especially after surgery, there's a lot of people who are a bit concerned about, well, when do you start? When's the optimal time to start applying this? Because you've just come out of surgery, people are at risk from blood clots and so on following surgery, just because you've been lying around and what's going on. We're probably a little bit more conservative in the UK than what we would be in places like America, whereas we'd probably wait sort of 7 to 10 days before applying it. In America, they're basically applying it day 1, day 2. Yeah, so I guess it's just the aggressiveness, and it depends on who the surgeon is, what their background is, what they're willing to accept, because that's where a lot of especially in those early stages, it's dictated by the surgeon and what they're happy with. A lot of the American surgeons have really come on board with blood flow restriction and are basically saying, we want this done immediately to stop atrophy and so on. Over here, we're a little bit more sort of, I guess, reserved and sort of take a little bit longer to apply it in. But 5 to 7 days after is probably a good starting point where you've made sure no one's got any risks or clots, and therefore you can start applying it. You get increased cardiovascular demand when you start to apply blood flow restriction and so on, but it's not any more than what it would be if you were lifting heavy. So there's a lot of things that people put out there and say, well, this blood flow restriction does this and it does that. But actually, when you compare it to normal resistance exercise or other type modes of exercise, it's not doing anything different. And that's across the board, adaptations through to safety aspects. So as long as you, in my head, can apply the correct pressure, standardize that in some way, those are some of the key things that allow us to do things safely. And we put together a paper a few years ago now. I think we reported it last time we were on. I can't fully remember, but we brought a load of people together. experts sort of say this is what we do, and do you know what? Nothing's changed in it. It's still the same things that we should be doing. It's free access; you can see it. So, that's where I would go to and have a look, and you'd see the sort of way things to concern about safety in that regard.
I've potentially left the most uncomfortable or area that we might need to be a little bit, or you might need to be a little bit careful about, and that's the technology. I know that can be a difficult thing to navigate, someone in your position. Since we've last spoke, there is more tech out there. I don't know what was on the market at the time. How can people navigate the different options that are out there when it comes to blood flow restriction technology?
Yeah, look, I think at its most basic level, everyone navigates blood flow restriction based off price. From speaking to different people, clubs, organisations, they are very price orientated in what they want to do and so on, and then that's what they will go with. You have the top of the range devices, which are more from surgical tourniquets, surgical tourniquet companies, and they have everything built in from limb occlusive pressure within them, right through to you've got just normal handheld cuffs, which you can just pump up, which you can maybe use a Doppler to set a pressure. You've now got equipment that's built into clothing, which then allows you to restrict blood flow restriction with by moving a band around the arm and so on. So there's loads of different companies on the market. There's loads of different things that are going there. I would, if I was a practitioner, the things I would be looking at is, one, what's the evidence that the device works? That's my key thing. I think we can say that blood flow restriction as a modality is pretty effective in certain situations. The evidence is there. There's well over 200 papers showing it works. But it's doing some things, standardized things across the board. And generally it's being able to set a pressure to a certain amount. It's doing certain repetitions and all these different things that go with it. So I think you have to really take that on board when you're looking at what's out there. But I think, again, I'm not involved in a technology perspective. I don't own any companies or anything like that. So I think the key thing to consider is, ask questions. What's the evidence that this is working? What's the evidence this is going to do this and that? Have you got it? People showing you what's going on and so on. And then you can start to sort of decide what it is you're going to do. I said most of the technology on the market works. I'm sure it does. It's restricting blood flow. I can take a band and tie my arm up right now and I'll get blood flow restriction and it'll be effective. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be the optimal way to do it and the safest way to do it. So that's where we have to consider what people are doing and how you're applying it and who you're applying it to. I think if you're applying it generally with your athletes and your healthy individuals, you can get away with a lot. And you do see that, even online, you see people use like tourniquets, like you would tighten up to take a blood measurement from, actually, if you're going to take a cannula and so on, take actual blood, venous blood and so on. So people are like, that's what people used to sell them on eBay for blood flow restriction. So it will work, of course it will. Whether it gives you a standardized reduction in blood flow every time and what you're doing and so on is a different debate. So I think there's certainly more options for people now, which I think is a good thing. I'm always a little bit sort of risk averse, so I'm always a little bit going, well, think about why you're using it and why you need it. So do we need, I don't know, as it gets more into the healthy general public, I get a bit more concerned with blood flow restriction. And that's just me with, research head on going, you just know someone's going to do something stupid. It's nature.
Someone's doing something for Instagram.
No, 100%. And then what happens next? All of a sudden there's some regulation over why we can and can't use it and so on because someone's done something that no one's ever suggested they should do. So that I'm a really strong advocate of it should be the practitioners who are guiding this and the practitioners who are sort of making sure they oversee it. Like someone at a club or organisation is the go-to person for it. Just so that you have a standardised protocol and approach within your own club or your own organisation. Because I think once you start going down the realm of just let everybody do what they want, let the players do what they want, you know what's going to happen. Because that would be if you did any type. If you said as an S&C coach, you said, I'm going to let the players decide what they want to do in the gym. They're going to pick all their exercises, going to pick all their loads. What do you think is going to happen?
Chaos.
Yeah, of course it is, and there's going to be problems, and someone's going to get injured, and then whose fault's that? So I think the same thing's going to happen, especially when we start going, well, you can do it at home and you can do it in your own time, you do this and that. There's a lot of people do things and use it, and I don't necessarily think they know what they're doing.
Cool. Right. Where is we've probably answered this throughout, it's probably quite obvious, but where's the research going for you guys, for various groups all over the world, and where's the best place for people to get up to date with the info that you're putting out, social media, ResearchGate, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I think, like, certainly from our perspective, we're really focused on the pain side of things recently. We've got someone at the minute who's doing sort of a lot of neuromuscular stuff and stimulating the brain to see exactly where some of this response is coming from and so on. So that's where we're doing some of our work on. The recovery side of things, again, is really kicked off in the last few years, and I know there's some people are looking at recovery. We're looking to do a few extra studies in that. Always willing to collaborate with people and so on, but we're looking to sort of try and understand things a little bit deeper with regards to recovery. And I think that's probably where you will see a bit of a movement in it, depending on what people, what comes out of that research. I think the biggest area, by any stretch of the imagination, is the aerobic side. The resistance exercise side is, I think I put a tweet out the other day. It's easy. Like, it really, it's not complicated. You put a load of 30% you want repetition max. You do 75 repetitions. You adjust depending on how people felt. You put a pressure between 40 and 80% of limb occlusive pressure. Go. do one or two exercises with some recovery in between, deflation in between. You will get a stimulus there, and you'll create an adaptation, and you can do that for a number of weeks until you need to transition off. Okay, that's easy. That's a real simple thing, and that's why people do it. It's most effective as well. In more recent times, the aerobic side of things used to focus a lot on, I think where people really jumped on it at the beginning was we got improvements in strength and improvements in muscle mass with aerobic exercise. And we don't get that with normal aerobic exercise. So adding blood flow restriction in there, especially in people who are less trained or deconditioned. Okay? And I know of one case in football that someone's, again, won't mention the team, but they've used a walking protocol only for one of their athletes in following surgery and actually or injury, and been able to maintain muscle mass throughout just with walking and blood flow restriction. So it is effective, especially when you're deconditioned or you're not training to the same level. It's definitely having that effect. But what people are now looking at is actually, can we improve the outcomes from an aerobic perspective? And I think even if you look in the last year, there's been about 3 or 4 different groups over the world that put out review articles, and all slightly different, where they think blood flow restriction and aerobic exercise is going to have its impact. So that's where I know there's definitely going to be lots of work going on. And you can imagine the minefield that becomes aerobic exercise. Because, I said, resistance exercise becomes much simpler when you look at it. When you start doing aerobic exercise, well, how do you create an aerobic adaptation? Well, you can do anaerobic type all-out sprints, and the recovery you get in between is what started driving the adaptation. You can do high-intensity aerobic intervals. You can do slightly more aerobic intervals around threshold and turn point and those sorts of areas. You can do long, slow, steady state. Already there's different modalities within aerobic exercise that you can use just to create a stimulus without then even applying blood flow restriction or different pressures or different intensities. And you see where it starts to get a bit murky. And I think it will take a bit of time for us to really get a full grip and handle of exactly what's going on. There is some really nice evidence there that's out there which shows it's effective. There's some really good work around. I think you get a central response. So we do get improvements in from centrally, but we also get a localized effect to the local tissue. We get increased capillarization and other things. So there's you may be able to target certain aspects of it, and that may lead into even things like going into altitude and heat and environmental factors that potentially we can. I think Jamie Burr, who I know you've done a thing with recently, Jamie's done some stuff, not published, but I've seen it at a conference. We're looking at hemoglobin mass and other things, and trying to look at some of the mechanisms behind what's driving some of these adaptations. Because again, they're getting big improvements in things like VO2 max and so on in very short periods of time, 2 to 3 weeks, if they're using it from a high frequency perspective. So the biggest difficulty is it's really hard for me to say this is the protocol for aerobic. Like, we did that in our paper 3 or 4 years ago, but it's a very generic protocol. In recent times, some of the Scandinavian groups have started to use high intensity intervals, so closer to sort of 60, I think the study did was 50, 60 and 70% of VO2 max for 5-minute intervals or 3-minute intervals, and then a period of recovery in between. But they had to release a cuff in between. I don't know whether or not you could get away with doing the same if you just did lower intensity like you did with the other groups. We just don't know. But both are having a really big impact and really big improvement in performance. And again, across the board, across performance, not just VO2 max, but performance, time trial outcomes. I know a lot of cyclists are now using it. Some of the Tour de France teams are now really looking at it. So there's a real big push in that regard. And then there's obviously an opportunity for team sports, some improvements in potassium ion channels and so on, which is really linked to high intensity intermittent performance and so on. So there's improvements there. So there's conditioning aspects that come into play. I think where it gets difficult is that you're still limited by the applicability of it and whether you can actually, you're not running with it. People have tried and people have looked at it, but I still don't believe you need the high intensity exercise. When you do high intensity resistance exercise, you're not able to do the repetitions because there's too much. The pressure and the load reduce the repetitions and you don't get an adaptation. And I think you're going to see the same with blood flow restriction. People have been using it, like my old supervisor, Richard Ferguson at Loughborough. They were using it where they do sprints and then put the cuff on immediately after to trap the metabolites in, which has some theory, but actually in practice is a nightmare to do and really hard to do. So it's trying to think about how it can work. And loads of people are coming at it from different angles. But I think certainly the aerobic side is where you'll see big changes in the next 2, 3, 4 years.
So what you're saying is in 2 or 3 years, we get back on the podcast and we get an update.
Yeah, that's about it. We've done
I'll stick in the diary.
Yeah, go for it.
Right, mate. Where's the best place for people to keep up to date with your work?
Yeah, probably most of the stuff's on Twitter.
Cool.
I'm on Twitter. Regularly put out our research and so on. That's probably the easiest way to find it. I've started to dabble in YouTube. We've done little videos of abstracts and stuff of just
nice.
what we do, but it's one of those. It's a bit of a pain in the backside to do, and you're sort of going. You want to get the information out, but actually, I'm not sure if it really makes much of a difference.
Mm-hmm. But you put a nice thread on about BFR a few weeks ago. That hit the spot, didn't it?
Yeah, I did think there was lots of interest in, but at the end of the day, as I said, I think I said in it, it's pretty simple. And it's not a difficult modality to get, and I think that's the thing. People then jump on it and go, well, we can do this. But again, it's just understanding, know why you're applying it. And that's the key takeaway. Understand the physiology and the reasons, the adaptations you expect to get from it, and then you can go, well, actually, it will make an impact here and here. And as a practitioner, you're making those decisions of where you think it is, and then you become a scientist and start going, well, actually, is it having an effect or not? And what does it look like compared to when we haven't done it in the past, compared to our normal rehab or our normal these things that we do in this situation with this athlete? And then you can start to say, well, actually, now as a club, we might need to engage with it more, or actually it's not working for us. And either that's because you're not doing it right. But, you look at the reasons why you're doing it, look at the way you're doing it, and then you can start to make those decisions and then work out yes or no.
Amazing. That has been an incredible hour for anyone who wants to know more about this area. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I really do appreciate you coming back on, especially for a second time. So thank you. We'll keep in touch and look forward to speaking to you soon.
No problem. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Stephen.
Cheers.